My name is Eric, and these are some of my creations. These models are made from a wide variety of materials, but what ties them together is that they all take place on the planet Aegis. Today we're traveling from the rocky perils of the Hemok coast to the arid dunes of Polsera. I'll take you along the process of building this model and share with you the story of this old man and his rickety mech. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. I keep expecting this part to become easy. I keep thinking that eventually I'll develop some kind of system, something to streamline the process and quicken my pace. But I suppose, as with all things, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. But then I had an idea. And it was literally this light bulb. For whatever reason, it sparked the idea for an ancient two-legged mech lumbering along a dusty path. So I went with it. Things got really interesting once the light bulb was sandwiched between two halves of a tank model, creating a lot of unique geometry. And at this point, that's really my main concern, creating unique shapes and giving the object a distinct eye-catching silhouette. With the pencil sketch done, I decided to push the concept even further, taking my time and carefully delineating all of the parts in ink. This helped me to think about what materials I'd use as I drew inspiration for the design from the plastic shrapnel littered about my workbench. When it comes to mechs, I've always felt that there must be a compelling reason to justify their existence. Practically speaking, wheels make a lot more sense. Having said that, I enjoyed this process of painting my concept art with watercolors while I considered what purpose a mech like this might serve and how that purpose would affect the design choices of its engineers. Thus was born the seed for this story. With the design and colors locked in, it was time to get building, starting with this plastic LED bulb and some Kinder eggs that were kindly donated to this channel. I've thought about registering a P.O. box to get more donations of this sort, but I kind of suspect that putting out an open invitation for people to mail me their garbage could backfire. And speaking of plans gone wrong, the idea here that I could evenly sand off the top of this plastic bulb to attach the faceplate was a mistake. This plastic is surprisingly hardy, and so I had to eventually saw at it with an X-Acto blade. Once I decided I wasn't going to get anywhere closer to a circle than this, I glued on the faceplate, which was Frankenstein from one of these Beyblade toys. To create a more gradual transition between these two pieces, I used Milliput, which is a sculptable two-part epoxy putty. By the way, the links to just about all of these supplies can be found in the description of my videos. One feature that I wanted to lean pretty heavily into for this mech was these frames and cages, elements that would imply that this machine was built to bear a good battering. The first of these frames was a hexagonal one that took a not insignificant amount of work for my smooth brain to calculate the dimensions for and then build from Q-tips. For the mech's fuel tanks, I used the short end of the Kinder eggs. Tiny cardboard circles inserted into these plastic hemispheres gave the hot glue something to stick to, and then it was all glued to the bulb. By the way, to drill precise holes into plastic, I found the best way is to nick the surface first with an X-Acto blade and then get a pilot hole started. After some tank wheels were added for detail, more Milliput was put around the fuel tanks for yet more gradual transitions, and this is where I ran into my first major problem with this build. My concept art had tons of details, like these pipes and tubes and vents, but I was running out of greeblies and had nothing right for this scale and level of detail. So I downloaded Blender and learned how to make my own greeblies. I'm very much a learn-as-I-go kind of person, so I didn't think it was necessary to learn every single function and tool of Blender to get started. I simply Googled the specifics I needed to make these pipes, then fumbled my way through it until I got this. And oh man, is that satisfying. By the way, you can find all the Blender files I made for this build on my Patreon. And full disclosure, some of these greeblies were also found on Thingiverse completely for free, and I provided links to those in the video description. I've used a lot of different materials for rivets, but for this build I went with this thick poster paper and my leather hole punch. Next came the fins. The technique is pretty simple. I print the paper to the dimensions needed, tape the paper to some styrene, and use it as a stencil to cut out all of the shapes. Then it's a simple matter of snap, 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 and it all gets plastic welded into place. It's strong, simple, and super poisonous to breathe in. I then notch the back of the fins to add these tiny hinges made from a 2mm acrylic rod, and whatever this is. For the snaking tubes and cables, I used more milliput, trying to follow the original design as closely as possible. It was then onto the body armor, which was appropriately inspired by actual armor from this tank kit. To fill in this gaping hole, I made a template from a cereal box, then transferred that to some 2mm styrene. Then came more greeblies, like these two guys here, which were used to hold some antennas in place, one of which was from the original tank model, and the other of which was from a guitar which can no longer play bass notes. Also, these powerful headlamps from a motorcycle toy, which are an essential piece of equipment for this mech. Once the top was thoroughly decked out in details, it was time for these underside cages. I used a scan from my concept art as the base design, then within Blender added vertices at each bend. I beveled these sharp angles to give a more pipe-like shape, then converted to curve and bumped up the depth and resolution for some thick, smooth shapes. I repeated this for the crossbars, making them a smidgen smaller, then trimmed the excess with a Boolean shape and added a flat ledge to give the glue something to stick to. And voila! We have cages that look a whole lot better than my sawed-up, redneck engineered toiletries. I added some more tank scraps to the lower hull armor, then coiled some aluminum armature wire around a tube to make a spring. A shock absorber. For the undercarriage, this 6-pack soda carrier was a perfect fit, and to make the innards not look quite so bare, I wrapped a giant acrylic ring in wire and inserted. The design of the legs was based on this piece from a Transformers toy. This toy was chock full of interesting panels, hinges, and other details that'll no doubt make their way into future builds. More greeblies, specifically designed to these dimensions, were added to plug up the toy's screw holes and make the style of design consistent with the mech's body. Then, a bit of 1mm styrene created a panel to fill this hole, and more greeblies were used to help bulk everything out. For the thigh joint, I used this stiff 2mm wire as an axle, drilling into the leg sockets to attach it. The axle fit pretty nicely into the soda can holder, but I saved the assembly for after painting. For the mech's calves, these dollar store Final Faction toys were absolutely perfect. The only trouble was that I needed some feet. Now, I probably could have built these from styrene, but time was running out for this build, so it was back to Blender for some quick modeling. I followed the concept design as much as I could, while also adding some elements that would elicit the feeling of excavator teeth, tying into the model's industrial, heavy machinery type vibe. The feet were then printed and glued, and like the other STL files I've made, you can find the print-ready design on my Patreon. For the human figure that would be crucial to this build story, it's still a little beyond my expertise sculpting a man from scratch, but this farmer miniature found on Thingiverse was a great start. I did make a few alterations though, starting with removing his farmer's hat by going into edit mode and deleting all of the vertices. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, so let me know in the comments if you know. I added some gear, a hat, then watched some quick tutorials on YouTube about sculpting in Blender. This enabled me to shrink down his hands to a more lifelike proportion and give his facial hair a bit of a trim. Because this character hails from the subterranean tribes of the Unders, his eyes and skin are completely unaccustomed to sunlight, so I wanted to build him a pair of custom eyewear. Using a screenshot as a flat image for the design, I modeled everything piece by piece, then attached to the figure. Then came the backpack straps, which were simply some curves with an object bevel, giving them their backpack strappy shape. In sculpt mode, I then did some touch-ups on his jacket to make it interact more realistically with the straps. And in trying to think ahead, I flattened his base a bit so that I could easily trim it away after the painting stage. I printed the figure on my Mars 2 Pro, and holy cow, this is magic, we're living in the future. I turned once again to XPS foam for the base, though I gave it its own base, using this thick styrene to help protect it from nicks and dents. This also made it super easy to get a clean edge using my wire cutter. The surface was then textured with foil, and then it was time for some rocks. Mine were made from this plaster of Paris and water, mixed and then drizzled into this silicone mold. I filled it up only part way so that the resulting rocks would be a bit shorter, then trimmed and shaved to fit. Instead of buying Sculpt-A-Mold, which is essentially just shredded paper and plaster, I mixed shredded paper and plaster to create a clumpy texture paste. This helped the ground to not look so flat, while also creating a more natural transition between it and the rocks. Once that was dry, I added another layer of texture paste, this one simply made from plaster, water, and a bit of sand-colored paint. And with that down, I sprinkled in some gravel and sand. And now that it was time to paint and assemble, it's on to the story.
You are watching Katie Builds. Thank you.
The old man squinted into the horizon as the sky bled itself of the last drops of sunlight. Even through the tinted lenses pressed tight against his eyes, the light of the world above ground was piercing, unrelenting. It licked his pale skin with a barbed tongue and stung his eyes. This was not his world. His name was Harkad, and for months he had been threading his way up, from deep within the planet's skin, where veins of magma had for decades provided the geothermal heat that ran the villages of the Unders. A world once rich with ores and gemstones, salt mines and groundwater, diamonds and river snails. A world still rich if one knew where to look. But those were the secrets that would die with Harkad and the rest of the village elders. It was knowledge too dangerous to pass on even to the next generation, for if the remaining royals on the surface ever caught wind of it, they surely would come looking, clawing, boring down, never satisfied with anything less than more than their due. It was in their nature to plunder and consume, as surely as it was in Harkad's nature to keep to the shadows. But it was against this very nature that he had been spit from the mouth of the caves, vomited up onto the ceiling world, as his tribe of the Harab Kif called it. As long as he had been alive, the Harab Kif had dutifully paid tribute to the Balami royals, faithfully sending a messenger to the surface every 5 years with deliveries of ores, gems, or whatever else the Balami house deemed valuable. When those had become scarce, they demanded human tribute to be paid, to work as servants within their citadel walls. 50 years ago, Harkad's only son had in this way been separated from him. His son, with the golden eyes as luminous as his mother's. Overcome with grief at the loss of her only child, Harkad's wife had become a recluse and had produced no additional children to bear the family's crest. Not that it mattered. The Harab Kif were a dwindling tribe on a shriveling planet beneath mounds of rock and dust. There was no future up or down. And yet, as long as the royals remained, tribute was demanded. Harkad could bring the only thing of value left, the tribe's Sin Almek, the surveyor machine. In the decades of its lifetime, it had mapped out tens of thousands of tunnels, had discovered a dozen precious ore deposits, and had rescued hundreds of lost or injured miners. It was a bitter thing, handing such a faithful machine to the ungrateful Balami, who would surely dissect it for its parts. But there was some comfort in knowing that this particular tribute held a secret. Beneath its shell plating, it carried something that the Balami had never seen in all their decades on the surface of Aegis. A small colony of fleas, insects, collected with care from an abandoned hyssop nest. A cluster of specks that carried a pathogen specifically developed to seal the womb. No bitten Balami woman would ever again bear children. Harkad would thus take from them the future that he himself had been robbed of. How poetic, he thought, that a great empire should be brought to its knees by the most insignificant of creatures. The iron nail that splits a boulder. He grinned, the final ray of sun glinting on his teeth. But the entrance to the Balami citadel was not as Harkad had remembered. Its gates were dappled with rust, the mosaics on its pillars chipped and faded. "You bring tribute?" called a woman's voice from the tower wall. Harkad gazed up, unable to find the source of the sound. "I do. I'm of the Harb Keef." "We've been waiting. Your walker will be put to work." "It will?" Harkad asked. A figure appeared now from a stairwell, silhouetted by the dim lanterns that began flickering to life in the terrace. She holstered her weapon and gestured toward the Sin Almec. "We are in need of a surveyor to locate more water. Our wells have been drying up. The sensors on your walker will be put to good use." "You won't dismantle it?" asked the old man. "Of course not. There was no one here to reassemble it if we tried. The engineers have all left," the young woman said, circling the walker with the scanner. "Left?" The woman did not answer as she accessed one of the walker's maintenance panels. Harkad held his breath. The panel was right next to the sample of fleas. "The House of Balami thanks you for your tribute." Harkad frowned. Not once had he heard of royals thanking their subjects. "It may be the last time," he said. "The Harab Keef have little else to offer. Our numbers are thinning." The woman did not react immediately. She continued her thoughtful inspection of the machine before finally shrugging. "It's not important. There is no one left to enforce the edicts. Most of the royals have gone off-world." "Then who are you?" Harkad asked. "I'm a guardsman and apprentice stonemason by day. We all bear many titles here. We are the sons and daughters of the serfs who were left behind. We do what we can to keep the citadel running." The young woman extended her hand and offered a smile. Cautiously, Harkad took it in his own, surprised by the hard, rough skin. But what surprised him even more was her golden eyes, luminous, an unmistakable glow. And as she drew her hand away to scratch at something on her wrist, Harkad felt his heart sink into the pit of his stomach, burrowing, as an Under's heart would, beneath layers of dust and earth, where only regret resided. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and as always, a very special thanks to the patrons who made this possible. Feel free to share your thoughts about the build and story, and until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.